This is the ultimate challenge. I would suggest that in the last 15 to 20 years, we have discovered so much more about the foundations of human learning and the position of human learning in what it means to be an intelligent adult, that we dare not ignore the findings. And those findings center on two or three things. The first one is that actually human learning is inspired by the need to find out answers. Our survival over 7 million years has been because we've been quick enough to actually think ourselves out of difficult situations by seeing the unusual thing that now needs to be done. So it's about inquisitiveness. It's about the relationship of the child to the family and the community. All of that is, if you like, the evolutionary bit. The really critical bit to us now is that in a world very different to where the human race came from, we need teachers who are so professional. They know how to address the key issues in young people's minds, which is about answering their questions, but answering their questions not in a way that kills the conversation, but answers the questions in the way that inspires the child to want to think more and more about that. And this is one of the problems I've had with my own profession, the teaching profession. Many other people will be listening to this. We teachers, because we're enthusiasts, love to give a complete answer. If we give children a complete answer, there is no more for them to do. I really do believe that the good teacher is the one who only takes the child so far and then steps back and gives the child the excitement. Oh my goodness, now I understand it. I've got it. Wow, hippie, this is good. That I think is absolutely fundamental. What I have learnt, why I say we can't carry on doing things we have to be, we've been doing it too automatically. We've got to think more carefully about it. The desire to learn, of course, centres very much on the fact that if we are going to be successful in life, however we describe being successful in life, we have got to be quick on the uptake throughout our entire experience. That means that we have to be continuously reflecting on what's happening around us against our assumptions and then seeing what is the next thing that we have to do. Now, the illustration that I so often used about this was that when I was at school myself as a 15, 16-year-old, we had one guy who taught Latin, and he was so boring it just wasn't true. He'd gone through the war, and all he really wanted to talk about was fighting Rommel in the desert. And I was so bored with Latin that I failed Latin the first time, second, third time, and I was just about to take it the fourth and final time, which if I hadn't passed, I wouldn't have got to Oxford or Cambridge, when the school carpenter came into the teacher's room and said, "Congratulations, you've just been chosen to represent the United Kingdom at an international exhibition. You are the best schoolboy woodcarver in the country." Now, the other teachers took no notice of that, but I was 16, and I thought, well, if I can be the best woodcarver, why can't I pass Latin? 16-year-old, the answer was obvious: my teacher's in the way. And this was not the sort of thing you did in the 1950s. I went to my Latin teacher that afternoon and said, if I'm to pass Latin, I can't come to any more of your lessons. I'll just have to teach myself. But I was ostracized by all the staff. In 6 weeks, I did nothing other than study Latin. At the end of 6 weeks, I went into the exam hall. Up to there was Latin. Went through the exam. 6 weeks later, when the exam results came out, I had the highest figure anybody from that school had ever gained in Latin. But I had actually forgotten all that Latin, the details of it. But subsequently, I have been utterly fascinated by the impact of Roman culture and Roman thinking, and subsequently to Greek thinking, subsequent to the thinking of the people of Mesopotamia. Something was fired in me that actually said, you've only just started, mate. You've got to take this on forever and a day. it's up to you to develop the skill to read into one person's explanation, into another person's explanation, something which makes sense to you. I once wrote a small book called Learning Makes Sense. And I think that's a pretty key phrase in my mind, because that experience with Latin and subsequent experiences, all kinds of things, it's always been, how can I tie these pieces together? How can I come up with a complete picture? So learning makes sense, or the realization that learning makes sense, to me matters a lot. But if we as teachers deliver stuff to children which doesn't have any questions in it, if we simply say, here is the answer to that question, here is the answer to that question, we are doing that child a grave disservice. Because until you can see a child's face lighting up when they say, my gosh, I've got it. Children need the eureka experience. They need to say, now I get it. We don't do that enough. The problem in British society, in English society at the moment, and I guess it's going right across the world, with the global education reform movement, we have tried to list all the things that we silly adults think every child needs to know. And we've filled up pages after pages after pages with stuff. And you give those to children and their minds just go blank. Yes, we have given them too much and we haven't left enough space for them to take over. And so I'm going to be very careful that I don't break this rule myself. Teachers can talk so much that there's not enough space for children to do the thinking. Mm-hmm. This actually is the most difficult question that you could ask, because it's absolutely fundamental and challenges the very nature of the society we built up around us. Years ago, when I was just finishing at university, I was having a holiday in the west of Ireland, which is where I left to go, and I was leaning on a farmyard gate, and the other side was a dear man who I later got to know very well, who must have been well over 80 when I met him. Farmer all his life. And he said, well, John, what are you going to do? And I said, I'm going to become a teacher. And he said, remember this, a balanced education is like a three-legged stool. A three-legged stool will balance on any surface, however rough, providing the legs are of the same length. Mm-hmm. And those legs are the home, the school, and community. And that has, if you like, being a starting belief in my philosophy about education. Each of those bits is complementary, and if you think you can just do it with one of those, rather than having a three-legged stool, you have an old-fashioned shooting stick with just one bit, and you can sit on the top of that and you'll probably topple over in any case. So that the balance between understanding that the role of the school is to help children formulate questions, formulate conclusions, think about other questions. The more their strength of experience in the community, the greater the number of questions they want to have. The greater is the emotional strength of a child through being there in a loving, competent family, the greater are their chances of riding through when things get rough. And so it's that complementary nature of the three parts of a child's experience. Now, in English society, and this all goes back to the Industrial Revolution, because if you actually know enough about that history, you'll realize that the first part of the Industrial Revolution in the 1720s, the people who brought about that were almost entirely self-taught craftsmen. Mm-hmm. They invented the steam engine, they invented the railway train, they invented this, that, and everything else. And they were delighted and excited by what they did. And that produced the first Industrial Revolution. Then the more successful society was with that, they said, what we really want is to find 20 people, for sake of argument, who can give us the rules that we should apply in each one of those situations. And so rather than having apprentices, we just give people 20 rules. And that so badly backfired that by the late 1790s, the early 1800s, we had literally swarms of children with absolutely nothing to do, roaming the streets of English cities, causing absolute mayhem, because their parents were working in the factories and there was no role for them to do. And it started, and you have to give the credit to this, it started with the churches who said we have a moral responsibility to save these children from eternal damnation because they have no purpose in life. And so the first schools came in England in actually as early as 1790, 1791, but mainly from about 1800. And the main purpose of those was to give children enough sense of responsibility for what they were doing to awaken them a moral responsibility for their lives. Now, we've jumped forward 200 years since then. We're now at the situation where in England we're saying we better extend the years of schooling from 16 to 18 to 19, possibly to 20. Why? Because actually deep down there's nothing else to do with the kids. And children see through that. And the more the technology is available, the more they know that they can find out so many of the answers that they want to find out, not by sitting in a classroom. And so the whole school system is facing unprecedented challenges. And you see it over here in Catalonia, and you see it wherever you go in the world. Nobody quite knows what to do with the school. So that, I mean, one of you as a head teacher for a long time, you must have absolutely fed up with people saying, why hasn't the school done something about this? And you're wanting to say, well, actually, what did you do about it years gone by? And so in this sort of highly institutionalized world we've got to, always look for somebody to pass the buck to and say, that's your fault. No, it's both. But equally, I deplore the arrogance of teachers who simply say, my role is so important, everything else has to be sacrificed for that. And I include in that the British government at the moment, who are now penalising any parent who takes a child out of school because it's the only time the family can have a holiday together. Now, I'm not using that as an excuse for people who say there's a cheaper rate to go on a world cruise if I leave a week for the... I'm not talking about that. I'm actually saying the arrogance of the school that says a week in school is worth infinitely more than a week you could spend anywhere else.
With your family.
With your family, yes. So you ask me what I think of the situation of teacher education, how it should change and whatever. A critique. I need to start that one really very carefully in saying that without really good teachers, by that I mean teachers who know their stuff but have the sensitivity not to bore their students. Without good teachers, we don't get there. Now, this is a terrible criticism of my own country over the last 5 or 10 years, where they're saying we have a real problem because teachers are resigning in vast numbers. The average length of time in a school of a teacher, in their profession of a teacher is less than 9 years between finishing their training and resigning. That means that at any one stage we have to train 4.5 times as many teachers as we used to train. And that's an expensive business. And so the reaction of politicians in a hurry, and educationists in a hurry, is to say, right, we have to make sure that teacher training is very specific. You'll be trained to deal with 14 or 16-year-olds. You'll be trained to do one subject or 2 subjects at the most. And we can get that training into a very short period of time. And this has been worsening over the last 10 years because increasingly our government is saying, actually, this is all a waste of money. Good teachers are born in heaven, they're not created anywhere else. So we just want to get as many people who want to be teachers into the classroom as quickly as possible, in some cases without any training at all. That has driven the serious sections of the teaching profession crazy. We're just not going to stick around with this. This is too stupid. Now the opposite of that is the illustration from Finland and several countries like that. And they're the Finns whose education system 70 years ago was very similar to the English. But because Finland lost the war in 1944 and England won, England simply said, we'll reform the old system. The Finns said, no, the old system doesn't work, we'll start all over again. And in the 40 to 50 years since that, Finland has totally and utterly redesigned its teacher education program, to the extent that teaching has now become so popular in Finland that there are 10 times as many people applying to become teachers as they will train, because their standards are so incredibly high. I say they're incredibly high, their requirements are very high as well. You can't start to train as a teacher unless you've got a 3-year honours degree in one subject, together with a 3-year honours degree in pedagogic development, and then you have to have a 1-year course after that. You can't become a teacher in Finland unless you've got 7 years of training behind you. Now that training is the wrong word. That experience is deep, it's deep experience. It's about getting the young potential teacher to reflect on their own experience, to understand what is going on, so that they are extraordinarily thoughtful. So effective is that actually only a couple of years ago, the Minister of Education in Finland recommended to his Prime Minister that the post of Minister of Education should be abolished, because the whole system is so well integrated into the life of Finland that he said, and the politicians agreed, there is no room for politicians to intrude into the management of teacher training. And that, to me, is the most wonderful illustration. But as a man, I would give you one other illustration, which may seem very trite to anybody listening to this, but as far as young Finnish women are concerned, the most desirable catch for a future husband is a teacher. Teachers are the most desirable figures for young Finnish women to marry. Now, what does that say about so many other cultures? It says they're beautiful and they're incredibly intelligent, and I would love to align with somebody like that. So, to me, that's the absolutely different, the fundamental difference in the middle of it. That in the world which we're moving into, you don't want teachers who have just learnt the rule book. You want teachers who actually understand it. We need a different brand of teacher educators, that is absolutely right. And those teacher educators have to draw upon the best experiences of intelligent people, including university folk, around. But I would say to you, and I better be very careful how I put this, because most of my experience recently has been in Canada, not here in Catalonia, that the nature of teacher education, I better be careful of my language here, is as boring as hell, and is so infatuated with its studying its own stuff that student teachers are bored out of their minds. And very recently, a year back, I was academic in residence at the University of Victoria in Vancouver Island, which is one of the best universities in Canada. And at the end of the first couple of days there, I was approached by a group of 8, 10, 9, more than that, more than nearly 20 students, who said, we are a core of disaffected education students. We have banded together into what we call the underground curriculum. And we're setting our own curriculum. The trouble is we have to follow the university one as well, but what we're doing is studying all the other ways that we should be thinking about this. It's intensely exciting, but it's a bit worrying because more than half of us have already resigned from the course of teacher education. Because
the students resigned.
The students were resigning. There's no point in doing this.
Yeah.
What we are discovering from the hidden curriculum is that the university course is about preparing more students, if they're very successful, to become university lecturers. And that is what has gone wrong. You need people training teachers who understand that the essence of a teacher is not about any single thing, but is about everything. It's a moral issue. We want teachers who are human enough to realize how alert they have to be to the world around them on the outside. And I have to say, I came out after a month of academic in residence with a long following of students, but with a whole series of totally disaffected university faculty staff, wondering why the hell anybody had ever asked me to come in and talk. And I suspect that can be mirrored in other places. And the more that politicians intrude and set up political expectations for the curriculum, the more the universities will be tempted to come up with answers to what the politicians said. And that's not what we're about. In the long term, that is a disaster. Because, in evolutionary terms, we survive because we have a very strong survival instinct, not simply to trust what we are told, but to find out for ourselves. Right? So we constantly, and you're a mother, you're a father, I've got children, I've got grandchildren, and the one thing that has always delighted me about them is, please Dad, why? Papa, why this, why that? And you think, this is the essence of life. And that takes a long time. And you think, can we cut away from that? And you can't cut away from that. Because those questions which come thick and fast can be about absolutely everything. They're not just academic. They're the child trying to work out how they're going to survive in this world around us. And that is incredibly important now. In England in 1944, when the present system was set up, schooling was scheduled to start at the age of 5. So we have a system starting at the age of 5 in theory. Progressively, and I suppose it's only over the last 10 years, the pressure from industry is to say we want more and more mothers back into work at the earliest possible stage. Now, I'm sorry if that sounds a bit of a sexist way of putting it, but that is actually the sharp edge of it. We want to get mothers back into the workplace. And so progressively, first of all led by government, but now more driven by the parents' need to have more time to earn money, we've got to the stage where children are going not just into childcare at 2, but into actual formal classes from a very early age. And so I'm watching this with horror as I see our just 4-year-old granddaughter, who is just lovely, but she is being totally exhausted by going to school every day from 9 till 4, and she's not happy.
It's a long day for young children.
It's a long day, and she's losing her sparkle. She doesn't look so happy, and her parents aren't so happy, but everybody else is accepting that. And it's not that the Finns just say you don't go into a classroom. They provide a vast array of community-based activity, formal and informal, so that the Finns did get it right. They knew they weren't the only ones who got it right. There is something about the maturation rates of humans that up until about the age of 7, learning to understand yourself in the context of a very small community is absolutely critical. Lose that, and you've lost it forever. Yeah, I once wrote a paper which was to develop into a book with the title Being Me and Being Useful. And I think those two things come absolutely together, because if a youngster feels they're just a cost to everybody, then you don't have much self-esteem. If you feel that you can be doing something which is useful, great. Now, I'll give you a funny little example of that. We used to have a farmhouse in the west of Ireland, and every year we went to 2 or 3 times a year, and my children grew up with the local farmers' children. The 2 neighbouring farmers to us, between them, they both had football teams of children. One had 11 children, one had 13 children. And in an Irish family, and I'm not talking about this as ideal, busy producing a child every year, there was a real role for the 6-year-old, the 7-year-old, the 8-year-old, the 9-year-old. And those roles are now scorned by people saying that's sweated labour. But an 8-year-old took greatest of delight in mothering the latest baby. Mm-hmm. And the 10-year-old thought the greatest achievement was that he could show his father that he could milk cows better than anybody else. And we all say that's child labour. No, it's not. In that sort of environment, it was, when they got to that stage, there was something which they could do. Mm-hmm. And it's the something which can be done, helps you to discover who you actually are. There's a certain amount to be said for competition, but that's not the ideal. Collaboration is something that you take with you into life forever. And competition, it's a very difficult one, this, isn't it? Because we do need an incentive to say that the bread won't automatically be on the table.
Healthy amount of competition.
Yeah. And I'd want to quantify a healthy amount. I mean, actually, a very realistic amount of competition is important. Opportunities for collaboration are extraordinarily important. And talking with people at the Finnish embassy recently, they're constantly saying they're very worried about this, because the drive from America is all about competition. And when I say the Finns are worried about that, because there is a global assault onto conventional schooling led by big business, which is actually saying this is a waste of money. And at the end of the day, I think I'd have to say you've got to be very serious about this. This is deep down a moral issue. And as I was reminded of this a good dozen years ago somewhere in Southeast Asia, addressing a conference, I think it was in Papua New Guinea. And I was reminded that we are forgetting the moral purpose of education. The moral purpose of education, at a most basic level that a Christian society can understand, is that you're actually preparing people for eternity. You're not preparing them for a working life. Now, of course, you have to understand a working life to get to eternity, but we've got it all screwed up the wrong way around. And that is a deep ethical issue. And there is, which is the reason for one of the books I wrote recently, Battling for the Soul of Education. What is the soul? And that kept Augustine and everybody else trying to work out the soul, but it's the inanimate bit that apparently almost has a life of its own, which is thing that inspires or depresses the individual, that there is something even more important out there to deal with. And that all goes back to St. Augustine. St. Augustine wrote a wonderful piece describing his schooling in Rome. He goes something like, "Oh my God, how I suffered. Nobody ever told me what it was all supposed to be about. I just got beaten every time I made a mistake." And that's what eventually inspired him, and he became, the patron saint of the first millennium, about the importance of the individual. And I know I'm diverging from the original part of the question, but there is a deep moral issue here. Do we believe that, and it's not difficult, do we believe that children are more than economic people? In one thing I've written, I said that people want to make the assumption that intellect and emotion are interrelated. So it's the same phenomena. And I want to challenge that. Because one of the mistakes made in England in 1944 was to say that you can actually measure intelligence at the age of 11. And that measurement of intelligence doesn't attempt to measure the emotional growth of the person. And what tended to happen was that those simple so-called intelligence tests were taken to cover everything that mattered. The emotions did not matter. Over the course of 20 years of that hard experience, every child on the 11th birthday was tested in that way. And on the basis of that, the top 1/3 was sent to grammar schools, top quality. The next 10% went to technical schools. The bottom 55-60% were regarded as being of no value to anybody. They would just become factory workers. And so a different type of school was invented for the factory workers of the future. After 20 years of that, more sophisticated testing of results came in, and to everybody's horror, they discovered that 1 in 5 of the children tested at the age of 11 was assigned to the wrong type of school. 20% of the population, which simply meant that a significant number of children who weren't clever enough to go to grammar school were sitting in the bottom class of grammar school not knowing what to do. It meant that a very significant number of children who were too clever to be left alongside the factory workers were totally dismayed for the rest of time. And what we're now understanding, and here the work of Howard Gardner and people like that is so vastly important, is that our intelligences come in a variety of ways. And now that is common parlance. We talk about multiple intelligence, we understand that. But actually it's taken a long time to get to that point. And sometimes even now I don't think we really do understand what multiple intelligences are. Because each one of them needs a genuine chance of growing. And so intellect can't just be taken for granted. It needs an environment in which it can grow in. Emotional skills can't just be taken for granted. Coming from a school which still has too many boys-only schools, so many young men are so emotionally immature they don't know how to form permanent relationships later on, and that may apply to this country as well as every other country. But I mean, emotional growth is something very important, and it doesn't automatically happen. The ones they leave on the side often include potentially the brightest students who are bored out of their minds from the very beginning. The one that really does intrigue me was in Pacific Northwest up towards Seattle 40 years ago. The class in which Bill Gates and some of his friends attended in a school outside Seattle. And by the age of 14, they were already so so infatuated with what they were discovering about electronic technology, the school had the foresight to say that it couldn't actually teach them anything more about that. But what it did was to liberate about half a dozen kids from the curriculum, give them a redundant laboratory, and I'm told that much of Microsoft was invented when they were less than 18 years of age, and they had the full range of their own laboratory.
Wow.
All right? Now, I don't think that is a total exceptional experience. I was appointed headmaster of an old English grammar school when I was very young, and I always have to apologise for what I'm about to tell you, but those were in that stage, the headmaster was expected to expel children who weren't doing well or who were rebellious. And for a number of years I had to live with that. And I have to say that what turned me into the man I am now was that I often found those that I had to expel were a damn sight more interesting than the ones that stayed in school. And that really made me, something about this is just totally wrong. And it is wrong. School doesn't exist just to produce new school teachers. Yeah, I mean, that to me is totally fundamental. That does not mean to say we don't expect to be able to go somewhere to have answers to our questions. But first we have to start off with those questions.
Yeah.
That was about 3 years ago now in Africa. I had a driver, this was somewhere around Tanzania, Lake Eora, I think, who was about 27, 28. On his own admission, he had never been to school, but he spoke 8 or was it 9 languages fluently. And when I asked him to explain, he said, well, there's nothing unusual about that. I lived in this particular village town, market town, which was the crossroads of 8 or 9 different tribes moving through every year. And that was powerful. At that same time, I think, there was an Englishman with me who had a 7-year-old daughter with him, and for some reason or other, I was out with a group of the Hadza tribe hunting, and this little girl, I suppose she was 8, tagged on and left her father behind, and I suddenly found I got this little 8 or 9-year-old girl with me, and then I think she started to panic and said I want to get back to camp. And I then realised I had no idea where the camp was, because I've gone with the tribesman. And so I said to the tribesman, this little girl needs to get back to the camp. And the chieftain turned to a kid no more than about that high, I suppose he might have been the same age, 8 or 9, no less than that, and said, he will take her back. And he did, and then I realised I'd been separated from her, and she was what had gone wrong? I thought, this is gross irresponsibility on my part. And then I realised that actually I had no way of finding my way through the forest. But the people that I was with, and the ones who were with this little girl, it was extraordinary. I watched one of the young boys. He stopped about every 2 minutes, stood on one foot, lifted the other foot up, held his hands out like that, stock still, seeing whether we were being followed by big game, with any vibration. Then, to make sure that we were going in the right direction, he looked at every tree to see which side the moss was growing on, and which side the sun was catching. And those youngsters of illiterate tribesmen could read their environment beautifully. At night time, when it came to lighting a fire, and this was out in the wild, so the fires were necessary to keep the big beasts away, they started telling stories. And they told stories for hours and hours on end. And this business of telling stories, again, this is evidence from that part of Africa. We think we're doing pretty well if we can sort of repeat it, quote stuff in an examination. but the most superb storyteller that ever recorded had a complete verbal memory of the equivalent of the number of words, double version of Virgil's Aeneid. Okay, the reason I think this way comes from outside, but I sort of turn that into a simple strapline. The present education system is upside down and inside out. Upside down because we put maximum resources when children are old, and inside out because we overemphasize the school and underemphasize the home. So upside down and inside out. So if you take a look at Finland, and I'm sorry, but that is such an interesting illustration. They virtually do another thing which I've said, and I copied this from them. Class size should never be more than twice chronological age. So at the age of 7, maximum class size of 14. At the age of 18, does that mean class size of 36? What it actually means is that probably for most of the time you don't need to be in a class. Mm-hmm. Right? So reverse that and you get a very, very different situation. But also, if you reverse that, you're upsetting the powers that be, because in my country, and I don't know about Catalonia, if you say you're the head of a secondary school, yes. If you say you're the head of a primary school, huh.
It's very true here.
Yeah.
It's the same thing, right?
And it's wrong.
It is wrong.
It is absolutely wrong. But it's also inside out. The wisdom of parents, the wisdom of grandparents, the wisdom of what you learn for yourself when you're reading each other's stories of, later sort of winter's evening, is deemed by the school to be not particularly important. But what happens at home and the habits that you develop about asking questions and finding the right way of doing things is critically important. So if I think of my 3 children that I was talking about beforehand, my eldest son did brilliantly at school, always got everything right, and so he's now ambassador. Our second son wasn't quite so malleable, and always, when we went off to church, he'd go off to the Buddhist temple. And we let him, we didn't, and we wanted to let him do that. And he started seeing things in different ways. And okay, he came through school and got all his qualifications, but it was no great deal. After about 2 or 3 years, he suddenly sort of put all his ideas together, and he's a very good artist. And that led him to create a very specialized firm for designing websites for the artistic community. And people are doing things like that. And he's doing extraordinarily well on that. And our youngest son, who I still think is probably the brightest of the 3 of them, 10 years, I wonder what the hell had gone wrong with him. He just sort of went his own way and did his own thing and didn't finish anything, whatever. And now he's going to be a almost qualified therapist, psychotherapist, because he's been through the other bits. So you never quite know where it's going to go. But the diversity of it is what matters.
And family has to play a major role.
And family has to play a major role. So that actually, I know the person who's going to welcome me back most after this, apart from my wife, is my youngest son. Because he suddenly realised that actually he's jolly lucky he's got to this position, because there were times when he would have gone all off the rails so many times, and I think he'll be brilliant working with troubled young people, because he understands how you can go off the rails. Well, I'm going to find it easier to pick up on that word subsidiarity that we were using just now, because subsidiarity is very simple. My memory's getting turned. It is wrong for a superior to tell an inferior what to do when the inferior is in a position to work it out for itself. That is really what it's about. And that is the basis of much theology as well. It is wrong to have to tell somebody to do something if they can have worked that out for themselves. What I think was the role of some of the 17th century thinkers in all this, of which John Milton was pretty critical. So what Milton wrote in his very simple essay on education was infinitely more significant than just what happened in England. But what Milton said, I call a complete and generous education that which fits a man to perform justly, skillfully, and magnanimously all the offices, private and public, of peace and war. Justly, skillfully, and magnanimously. Wow.